Hello everyone, I know it's been a really long time since my last review, but today I will go over Ninja Gaiden 3 for the NES. If you saw my reviews on the other two Ninja Gaiden games, then you know full well this one will eventually be covered. Now to be honest, I have mixed feelings about this game since it has its pros and cons. However, it is still the worst in the entire NES trilogy. So let's see what it brings us. The story opens with Ryu's girlfriend Irene discovering some kind of laboratory when all of a sudden an imposter looking exactly like Ryu Hayabusa attacks and forces her off the cliff, where she is presumed dead. The Ryu later on finds out about this and goes after Irene's killer. Along the way, he gets some tips from a stranger named Clancy, where he would eventually come across his former acquaintance Foster from the first Ninja Gaiden game. Yeah. As well as having a run-in with his look-alike. Now the events in the story takes place in between the first two Ninja Gaiden games. Also, during the second half of the story, we see constant flashing background images, one too many. The story goes on a spiral sci-fi angle involving subspace, androids or bio-noise for this game, high-tech stuff, and evolution.
Evolution is a mystery, full of chains that no one sees. Clock makes a fool of history.
If you ask me, this story seems kinda silly, and could have had a better direction. Well, like the previous two games, controls hasn't changed at all, but there are a few tweaks in this one. For one instance, getting hit by an enemy doesn't push you back as much, so that's good. However, you tend to stay in the air longer, which is kinda odd. Also, we finally get to hear Ryu's voice every time he attacks. In addition to his usual wall climbing, Ryu can also hang from platforms and vines and move across them as well as jumping on them. The graphics and music are still good as ever, but the latter could be slightly underrated. Ryu gets some new power-ups, but unfortunately loses the shadow clones from the second game. One of them is a must to get for every level in the game, and that is the Strider-like extension of his sword, or aka the Super Sword. The only thing that sucks about this weapon is that every time you complete a level and start a new one, you lose it. Thanks a lot, fucking Tecmo. Also, there is usually an item to get that puts you in a temporary invincible state. Well, you have to use ninjutsu in its place. Then there's this vertical boomerang that comes quite in handy while you're hanging from platforms. Well, I just lost my first set of 3 lives, but since this is a Ninja Gaiden game, there are unlimited continues, right? The first thought in my mind after seeing this is... What the fuck?! You've got to be joking, Tecmo, right? Despite being the most balanced game in terms of difficulty, it's still a Ninja Gaiden game. So why in the hell did you have to put fucking limited continues in this? Also, the continue word would have been nice to show. And what's this? You gave us 5 instead of the usual 3 continues? That is really reassuring, but it doesn't mean shit in a game of this caliber. Limited continues. Seriously, you have never saw this coming. This also happens to be the first and only Ninja Gaiden game where mechanic stages and enemies come into play. Some of the stages have the recycle elemental hazards, but in this game they're not as bad. Except for the spike ones, and they become a real problem towards the end of the game. Now for the enemies. You know those fucking birds I despise so much, as well as most people do? Well, they have been replaced by these mutant mech insectoids or alien copter suckers. They are enormous and go back to doing 3 damage to your life instead of 1. which I can understand given their size. Did I mention that not one enemy in this game does 1 damage? Even the basic ones only do 2 damage minimum. Like, okay, that's kinda not fair. Lastly, I'd like to point out that the enemies do not respawn. Thank God for that at least. If you play the past 2 Ninja Gaiden games, then you should know the attack pattern of most of these bosses. The only ones that seem different is a Rocksteady wannabe who digs into the earth and shoots out fire a couple of times. Then we got a boss that's probably just as easy as the first stage one. You shouldn't have a problem at all beating this guy. As usual, the last 3 bosses are in sequence, but the first one is definitely the hardest. The easiest way to beat him is having that flame ninja that shoots up when he's close to the ground. Then use your super sword and take a few swings at him. Finally, dodge the crazy ass lightning striking you afterwards. This boss has the power of Zeus literally at his side. Or it could be Thor's handiwork.
By Odin's beard! Feel heaven's wrath!
Then of course, let him move for like half a second, use the flame ninjutsu again, and repeat until he's depleted. I suppose that's it for this game. You know, every Ninja Gaiden game has something dreadful to hate about it. The first game is pretty much the last stage sends you back to the beginning if you lose against any of the last 3 bosses. The second game has the multiple stage hazards, and the last game has limited continues! However, despite that, it's still an enjoyable game, and therefore gets a rating of 8 out of 10 in my book. Of course, there is a newer version of the Ninja Gaiden games for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. The question is, will I eventually get to reviewing them as well? Only time will tell. Now I leave the end of the review to Clancy. So until next review, take care.